is up? It's the Pro Football Focus Fantasy Podcast. My name is Jeff Ratcliffe, and it is Monday, June 1st. We're in June. We are in June. We are a month away from the traditional start of the build-up, the start of the fantasy football draft season. Exciting times there, but not much going on in the NFL right now. Not a bad thing, but not a ton to talk about on the news front. So today I actually want to go back to what we talked about on Friday's show. A lot of buzz about that topic, and use that as a launching point. We're going to talk about the state of the position over the next, 4 shows. We're going to talk about each of the 4 skill positions and what we're looking at here heading into 2020. And instead of kicking off with running back like I always do, I want to start with tight end because it does deal with Friday's topic. So if you didn't listen to Friday's pod, we were asked a very intriguing keeper question. Essentially, it was Dalvin Cook in the first round at pick 1-9 or George Kittle in the 11th. And for me, honestly, George Kittle in the 11th, George Kittle in the 10th, George Kittle in the 7th, none of them really make that much of a difference to me because you're getting George Kittle obviously at a value. But the key point here was that it was a 10-team league. And I went through, broke down that you're not getting as much of an advantage in a 10-team league with an elite tight end as you are in a 12 or certainly in a 16-team league because that's right around where the depth of the position really starts to fall off. So that's what I want to talk about in a few minutes. But I do want to comment here because I knew the reaction. I said it on the pod, the knee-jerk reaction that the answer is, it's George Kittle. You have to keep George Kittle. And that played out on Twitter. Some of you listeners have that perspective, and that's all good because, hey, I'm never here to tell you there's a right answer to the question. There are many different ways to approach fantasy football successfully. However, there were some responses, and I could tell who listened to the podcast and who didn't because some people will just blindly respond to tweets without, having any idea what the tweet means, right? So there were these responses, though, that basically stated that, hey, George Kittle is the only answer to the question. This isn't difficult. This is easy. The reality is in fantasy football, especially season-long fantasy football, there is an echo chamber. And the echo chamber isn't just among the players. It's among the industry analysts as well in some instances with this assumption that, hey, there's only one way to do things. And in this instance here, you're keeping, obviously an elite option with a later pick. That's certainly one approach, but as we broke down on the show on Friday, we're using a little bit of game theory as well in that if most people are going to go one direction and you go in a different direction, you potentially could have an edge on the masses. I've talked about this before, like zero RB. If everybody is doing zero RB, it is no longer a strategy, it's status quo. But in this instance here, the approach that I laid out, you're prioritizing getting an elite running back because the position isn't as deep as a lot of people initially seem to think it is. You're getting a guy who there is no way you could get at 1-9. If you put him back in the pool, he's coming off the board. If he's not a top 3 pick, he's a top 5 pick in that draft. And it doesn't even matter who's kept. You're not getting him at 1-9. You could get Kittle later, but whoever you're getting in that 1-9 spot, I'm nowhere near as comfortable with as Dalvin Cook, and it ultimately boils down to, that comfort level. So a little bit of game theory, a little bit of roster construction, and certainly going way against the grain of what a lot of people would think there. But a lot of times that is what ultimately, hey, that's the foundation, by the way, of zero RB. The foundation of zero RB is if everybody's loading up on RBs early, punt the damn position because you can get crazy good value at wide receiver, load up on wide out, and then, attack running back later. It's tricky. There's no doubt about it. And there's, obviously there are pitfalls to fading the masses. In some instances, the masses could be right, but this is one of those instances where I don't think they are. So I thought that was a fascinating discussion, but I also think it is fascinating that so many people simply assume there's just one right answer to to a fantasy football question, and I really don't think that's the way it is. I think there are a variety of approaches out there that can be really successful, but we got to keep an open mind to that sort of thing. That's really one of the things I'll talk about a lot as we get into the thick of fantasy draft season is flexibility. You can't go in with a very rigid mindset of this is how I'm going to approach every draft. The reality is that your drafts are going to be different. Your decisions across fantasy football are going to be different given each unique set of circumstances, and having more in your arsenal, more perspective, and the potential to use something like game theory is quite valuable. So there you go, a little bit of that, but it does lead me into this discussion of the present state of the position that I dislike so much for fantasy football, and that, of course, is tight end. And I don't dislike tight ends. If you are a former tight end or maybe even a current tight end, you play college football, high school football, whatever, you're playing in some kind of semi-pro league, whatever, I respect tight ends. I respect the F out of tight ends because they have a pretty tough assignment. You got to be on that line blocking some of the time, and where you're catching the football, man, that is a tough part of the field. There's no doubt about it. I do love tight ends on the field. I just don't like the way that they're set up for fantasy purposes, and I've talked about this ad nauseum. The Cliff Notes, here it is. A tight end can go out and have 3 catches for 32 yards and a touchdown. Another tight end can go out and have 3 catches for 32 yards, and because the first one had a touchdown, fantasy players think that player had such a better game than the one who didn't have a touchdown. And the reality is neither one of them really dominated or anything like that. One was just fortunate enough to get one of those catches in the end zone. That's it. But he scored double the amount of PPR points, basically, because of that touchdown. That's my problem. The scoring system's broken. And you can't fix that with a tight end premium. Tight end premium, the value of tight end premium is it essentially starts to even the playing field between the top tight ends and then your top running backs and wide receivers in terms of fantasy scoring. But it doesn't. If anything, it furthers the gap between the elites and the non-elites. And I know people are going to say, well, that increase strategy that you would have to prioritize getting one of those elite tight ends. And I'm not arguing against that per se, but my problem has always been the perspective of fantasy players that, this tight end is so much better than this other tight end, when reality says that they're basically the same guy. That's the issue. That's the issue we ultimately need to fix. There's a couple things that are broken with fantasy for sure. I do think that, when we talk about quarterback, the value of rushing yards it really has dramatically shifted the quarterback landscape. And I'm not just talking about Lamar. The writing has been on the wall for this. Even a decade ago, Tim Tebow was a QB1. He was a top 10 fantasy quarterback for a good stretch of his career as a starter. And he was not a good starting NFL quarterback. So, and Lamar, it's interesting because Lamar was fabulous last year. So it's a tricky debate to have. How do you ultimately level that out? And I don't have that answer right now. Team defense, too. That's the other one. Team defense scoring is, but I won't get off on that one. We're not going to do a state of the position for team defense. But let's dive into this. The state of the position for tight end, which is a brutal position, which is a position that if you don't get one of the top 2, then you're really hoping that the next 7 or 8 are really going to at least stay where they are, if not, border on elite production. Because we know the top 2 are going to be elite. I don't think Travis Kelce's going anywhere just yet. He's no spring chicken, but he's not going anywhere just yet. And George Kittle, when it's all said and done, there's a lot of talk of Gronk right now as the GOAT, or, Kelce could be the fantasy GOAT. I wouldn't say from a pure football standpoint, Kelce is a better player than Gronk in his prime, but I don't know if Gronk wasn't as explosive as Kelce. Gronk was he was surprisingly a lot more mobile than I thought he was going to be coming into the league. If you go back to his first season, it was a lot of touchdown production, but not much other than that. but he showed just the extreme athleticism. But Kelsey's on another plane with that because he's so silky smooth. He's just so explosive for his size. But when you look at Kittle, Kittle has that, and then on top of it, he's got Gronk's ability to block. It's not like Kelsey's a slouch, but Kittle is, I mean, we could be looking back in 10 years, wouldn't surprise me, and we say, wow, he's right there with Gronk, if not better. He isn't there yet, obviously. We're really early on, and it does sound like he's gonna get himself paid. That's some of the talk right now. But the question ultimately with these guys is, does it warrant taking them as early as you're going to have to take them? You're going to have to take them in the second round this year. There are folks out there, and especially those who might advocate for more of a zero RB type approach, that would say, yes, it is worth taking one of those two because you're essentially putting yourself at a weekly advantage. Now, remember, the size of your league is going to dictate this. I do not think that is the case in a 10-teamer. In a 12-teamer, we get just far enough so that there are some teams who could be hurting week in and week out at tight end. And they could play the either streaming game or they have two tight ends and which one do I start this week game. You know that game? That game's fun, isn't it? Especially when the guy you don't start outscores the guy you start every week. You know that game? Yeah, I've played that game too. We all have, and it stinks. So yes, in a 12-teamer, you're going to have more of an advantage, especially over the teams who, fall into the Gronk area. So I think Gronk will probably end up being it depends. He should probably be about the 8th, 9th, 10th tight end taken. He could be as early as the 6th tight end taken in leagues, depending on how much people fall in love with his name. But if you're in that territory, the Jared Cook territory, the TJ Hawkinson territory. I love me some TJ Hawkinson. Don't like his schedule, though. The Mike Gesicki. Oh, I love Mike Gesicki. Don't get me wrong. But man, am I that confident in him and being a consistent producer this year? Heck no. I mean, I'm guessing he's going to basically have to play wide receiver in that offense too, by the way, because it's Chan-Gelly offense, which means 4 wideouts. So anyway, that's a topic for a different time, I suppose. Either way, 12-team league, you're starting to gain a weekly advantage at that position. So it does benefit you a little bit more there. But for me, I still always take that approach of I don't want to grab the established elite guy. I want to try and get my hands on the next elite guy. Who is that this year? I don't think it's Zach Ertz anymore. I think Zach Ertz, you know what you're going to get. You can almost set your watch to it now because they're going to run a ton of 12 personnel, so I'm not worried about Dallas Goedert. So Zach Ertz is going to go out there, and he's going to get you, your 80, 85 catches, probably close to 1,000 yards, that type of production that you're used to. 5, 6, 7 touchdowns. It's not like he's going to score 15 touchdowns. And he's going to be very much just a rock-solid tight end one. With the occasional, he can have the occasional 10-catch game in there. We know that's Zach Ertz. I mean, that's Zach Ertz. Mark Andrews could take that next step, but I think everybody is also thinking that. Because Mark Andrews certainly flashed major potential last year. So a lot of people are thinking that, though. So yes, could he be the next in that elite territory? Sure, but you're gonna have to pay for him. Darren Waller, what he showed us last year is the potential to be in that range too. My one thing with Darren Waller, and it's not really directly with Darren Waller, is that there's more mouths to feed in Vegas now. There's more options. So it takes a little bit off of his plate potentially. So really, if I look at the guys who could be that next, other than Andrews, you're paying the premium price for Andrews. That next elite, who is the next? George Kittle. Hey, George Kittle, I don't mean directly like the player. I mean the fantasy option. Who's the next guy who we're going to look at as outside of the top 2 or 3, who next year everybody says is an automatic top 3? Who is that guy? And it doesn't happen every single year, but I would love to identify that guy because here's the beauty to it. Unlike Kelsey and Kittle, who you are going to have to pay full price for them, right? You're not getting a discount on those guys. Now, if you do get a discount, by the way, if you Travis Kelce's there in the mid-third, yes, fine, no problem. That's a discount. But you're probably not going to have that. You're not going to get a discount with Mark Andrews. However, the next guys, you very likely will get that discount because you're drafting them in the middle rounds, and if they finish in the top 3, oh, baby, you got an ROI on those guys. And that's the thing. If you can get positive ROI on every single one of your picks, you're going to dominate your league. You're going to freaking dominate it. So who are those guys for me this year? It's really the 3 of Tyler Higbee, Hunter Henry, and Evan Ingram. And there's question marks with all 3 of these guys. And I know that the big question mark for a lot of people with Higbee is Gerald Everett. Not really worried about that as much as maybe others are. With Hunter Henry, it's the quarterback situation. With Evan Ingram, it's really the health situation. But those are the guys. If there's a player at tight end who this time next year, we're going to be saying is a lock top 3, who wasn't a lock top 3 this year, it's one of those 3 guys for me. I don't see it coming deeper down the list. I just don't see that because of the depth of the position. So that's why, for me, those are the 3 that I'm going to target. I'm not going to go after just one of them because I'm going to try and keep my exposures right. So I'm going to go after all 3 of them. And in keeping that in mind, like if you're drafting, say you have 3 home leagues, and you don't want to overexpose to any one of those guys, you could get each one of them on a team. Now, granted, if you're really confident in one of them, if you're super confident in Evan Ingram, then sure, load up on Evan Ingram if you want. Because after that point, like I said, I have it Gronk and then Jared Cook. You know, the elder statesmen, I mean, sure, they're in really good positions to produce, but I don't think I'd see either one of them as a lock top 3 next year. So what kind of ROI are we looking at? Now, after those guys, that's where things get very interesting. If you don't want to take a middle round tight end, you don't want to take a premium, and you don't want to take a middle round tight end, then really you're going to have to address it with the TJ Hawkinson, Gesicki, Noah Fant. Noah Fant may go before those guys. It all depends on the draft. Even Hayden Hurst, who will go after those guys, but those are all in the mix for maybe not this time next year we're talking about him as elite options, but this time next year we're talking about him as top 10. Like, I could certainly see that with Noah Fant. Could certainly see that with Mike Gesicki, as some of these other names maybe start to fade a little bit, as Jared Cook maybe fades. Or we take one of these guys, Higbee, Henry, Ingram, and, we aren't buying in on him as much next year. It's kind of like what David Njoku was for us last year, right? A lot of people had him as either borderline top 10 or just inside the top 10. Now we're not even talking about him anywhere close to that for obvious reasons with Austin Hooper in the mix. So anyway, that group is appealing because, and you could throw Dallas Goedert in there as well. It's just tricky with Goddard because of Ertz and his presence there. But that group is really intriguing, and I think you could also potentially, if you're going to draft 2 tight ends, draft one from the Higbee, Henry, Ingram crowd, and then one from the Gesicki, Fant, Hawkinson, Hurst, Goddard group, and you just got some crazy upside in both areas. It's not a safe and upside approach, but I use that at quarterback, not necessarily at tight end. A couple other names, and I guess these are more streamer names that we're going to have to keep an eye on because I skipped over Austin Hooper. It's a tricky situation there. I like Hooper, but I have him at 13, and it's really a ceiling floor thing for me. I'd actually be more inclined to draft somebody like Noah Fant, who I've ranked behind him, Dallas Goedert, who I've ranked behind him, than to draft Austin Hooper at value, because and that's, I often talk about, don't just look at rankings and draft by rankings. This is a great example. Yes, I have Hooper ranked ahead of those guys, but if I'm in that range and Hooper's on the board, I'm probably looking at the other positions. I'm not looking at Hooper. But some of the deeper, maybe streamer-worthy guys, I mean, Jack Doyle, not a high ceiling, so I'm not going to be looking at him as a streamer-worthy guy, but Ebron, Jonnu Smith, Chris Herndon, Blake Jarwin, Irv Smith Jr. And Irv Smith Jr. could be a guy that this time next year is in that sort of how we're viewing Fant and Hurst and Gesicki right now. That could be Irv Smith next year, by the way. Ian Thomas is also in that conversation, same with Jay Sternberger. That's sort of the state of the position for me, at least in most leagues. I don't think we're going much deeper than that. I mean, you could be in some deep best ball. There are some tight end premium best balls that, you're going to look at deeper names like Greg Olsen and guys like that. But right now, that's sort of how I'm viewing the position. So you see I'm sort of segmenting it off, tiering it off into these different groups, and then prioritizing those groups for draft day. So we'll do the same exercise throughout the week at each of the positions, really trying to get a firm understanding of what the position is, how it looks, and then ultimately we're going to use that to our advantage to completely exploit our drafts and just dominate the competition. All right, so in the meantime, head on over to PFF.com. Lots of good stuff happening at the website right now. And, of course, you can follow along with me on social media at Jeff Ratcliffe on Twitter and Instagram. And I see you, Rat Packers. Use that hashtag RatPack. And that's how I know you're a listener of the show. All right, I'll be back tomorrow with another edition of the pod. For PFF, I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and I'm out of here.